Welcome back to the Sci-Fireplace. Let's talk about the books that I've read. I'm not going to bother ranking these. They were all great. They're all really good. The first one that I read was The Best of C.M. Kornbluth, edited by Frederick Pohl, who was his friend and kind of co-conspirator. They co-authored a lot of novels together. Not a lot of them, but a few of them. And Kornbluth is, I mean, as all of these guys kind of are at this point, but especially Kornbluth more than his contemporaries, a bit forgotten, which is too bad. He started publishing, I think, in the late 30s, early 40s, and he wrote a lot of crime fiction. He wrote like action stories as well as science fiction, and as you can tell, he wrote horror as well. There's some excellent sci-fi horror in this. Interesting author, like personally very iconoclastic. He was known for not brushing his teeth ever, and he had a weird past. He was in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. He got injured, and he died fairly young. I think he died in his 40s. The writing on display here is as good or better than any of the really huge Golden Age names that we all know. And I say that having not fully done my homework. I haven't read all the Asimov, I have not read all the Heinlein, I've not read all the Bradbury, but I really have very few compunctions about including this name in their company. It was every bit the literary craftsman, certainly of Asimov. He's a better writer than Asimov. And he had a really interesting voice as an author. Kind of a misfit for his era. And Pohl meditates in the introduction on this, and I have the same thoughts of he really doesn't know where Kornbluth would fall in the culture war of the new wave authors coming in and shaking things up in the 60s. Because his sensibility and his perspective feels very new wavy, but his writing style is very strictly not. He's more like a Hemingway. It's another thing that Pohl comments on, is he has this incredible economy of language where he can just create an entire novel's worth of world building in just a handful of pages in his short stories. My favorite of the stories is With These Hands, which is one of the simpler ones. It's a near future story about an artist attempting to make a living with his art, teaching art classes, and coming to terms with his obsolescence. This is the first short story that I ever read from Kornbluth. It was in a compilation book that I reviewed early on in the life of this channel, and I loved it as much or more this time around reading it as I did before. I think it's profound. I think it's just a funny and beautiful and very melancholy story. There's another story that I particularly love called Friend to Man, about a guy that gets stranded in a desert on an alien world and is taken care of by this large insectoid alien who learns to speak English to him. And I can't say anything about it without spoiling it, because it's a fairly short story, but just excellent, just perfect. And Kornbluth has a through line of personality that really like distinctly shines through. Very super cynical, amazingly cynical for the era that he wrote in. He wrote well, actually, I think a series of stories, starting with Little Black Bag and then expanded into The Marching Morons, that is the source material for Idiocracy. I don't see a way that it couldn't be the source material for Idiocracy, even though I don't think Kornbluth is credited in that movie. It's a much smarter rendition of that plot. He also is a funny writer. There's this story, The Advent on Channel 12. It's only 2 pages long, and it's a commentary on the rising popularity of Disney television. It's just such a vicious satire that it actually made me laugh out loud when I was reading it, which doesn't happen all that often when I read anything. I really can't help but be really impressed by Kornbluth, and sad that he didn't produce more work before he died. The next book I read was Hothouse by Brian Aldiss, or Aldiss. And in my top 15 sci-fi books I've ever read video, the first book on that list, number 15, was a book called Midworld by Alan Dean Foster, which is one of the early science fiction novels that I read in my teen years that made me like science fiction. And In retrospect, having read this, it really diminishes my opinion of that book. This is a much worthier novel. It is a Hugo winner, as you can see, and this has a terrible cover. The other covers are all gorgeous and impressive, and I'm sure I'm showing them to you now. What I really wanted was to dig into just some fun, big, dumb world building, some interesting texture and ideas, and just kind of get lost in pseudo-entertainment science fiction, because it had been a while since I read one of those books. So I picked Hothouse because I figured that would be the case, and it was a lot more. It's a far distant future, dying Earth story about the planet halting in its rotation so that one side, one hemisphere is facing the sun and one is in perpetual darkness, and it's millions of years in the future. Human beings have evolved to have green skin and to be quite small and to live in small tribes, kind of as arboreal apes living in this huge planet-spanning forest. And most of the life forms that are familiar to us have died off entirely, and all that is left is a tiny contingent of humans coexisting with a slightly larger contingent of insects, but most of the life is semi-sentient plants that have undergone, what is it called? Symmetrical evolution. What is it? Where parallel evolution. So there are plant equivalents, rough plant equivalents to familiar animals like birds that are sort of self-aware, sort of aren't, and are carnivorous and predatory. So the world is full of danger, peril around every turn, and people die constantly. It almost has this Game of Thrones thing going on where people just get killed off left and right, and it's merciless in the narrative treatment, the unsympathetic treatment of the characters. Even young children getting brutally killed, which is pretty fun. And just plunges you right into this world and starts building up this big universe that just gets bigger and bigger, and there are all these spectacularly cool creatures. It's this whole topiary of like weird, evil, predatory plants, and it just gets weirder and weirder and weirder. And it's technically science fiction, but it reads like a fantasy book. It's almost like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, and I would feel pretty confident classing it as science fantasy. So it's a quest of a protagonist going through this world on this journey of basically just trying to survive. It takes him to some wild places, and there's just all kinds of cool stuff that happens. Again, I don't want to spoil it. Even like the early reveals, I don't want to ruin the magic of the reading experience, because it is kind of magical. The prose is not like amazing until the last part of the book. It's very workmanlike, just kind of pure world building, cool science fiction type writing, but it's really good. And there's this interesting narrative thing that happens where it's almost like Aldous playing leapfrog with himself, where there will be a little bit of action and then there will be a passage of info dumping. And it's pretty transparent what's happening, but it's elegant enough that it doesn't really detract from the reading experience, and it just draws you further and further in. It's really super engrossing and fun to read. And then the last little bit of the book, I would say the last quarter, like the last act of it, is genuinely really beautifully written. It's tied up in this bow at the very end with yet another big science fiction conceit. Everything pays off nicely, and we're sent on our way with this sense of wonder about what we just read. I loved it. It's one of my favorites ever. Big, strong Jack Vance flavors. There's a little bit of kind of the Vancian humor in it. That sense of phantasmagoria and encountering weird, buffoonish characters out in the world. This is a strong, hard recommend. This is a full-throated recommendation. It's fun and really engaging and cool and big spectacle, big scope, blockbuster science fiction that has a content of ideas that are not stupid. The one that I read right after that is Blood Music by Greg Bear, which follows right behind Hothouse in terms of my estimation of it. It's really, I can't say for sure which of these I actually like more, and it's a weird little bit of serendipity that I read these back to back because there's a lot of parallel. There's some strange thematic symmetry between some of the ideas in Hothouse and some of the ideas in this having to do with the idea of genetic memory. I did not expect this to be the book that it was on any front. I thought this would be a sci-fi horror book that would be kind of like watching a movie from the 80s. I thought it would be kind of broad strokes. It was far and away one of my favorite science fiction books that I've ever read. Again, so it's about this bioengineer working in San Diego in the near future who invents a kind of white blood cell that has self-awareness. And he's using company time and money to do the research, gets found out and gets in trouble and gets fired because of it. And in order to preserve the progress of his work, injects the blood cells into his own bloodstream. And things go awry, and he undergoes a remarkable, sometimes horrifying transformation. The first bit of the book is very much like the Cronenberg version of The Fly, structurally pretty much identical. After that, it goes places that I didn't see coming whatsoever. Well, that's not true, because there's a blurb on the front that kind of spoils it a little bit, and I'll spare you, but it's compared to a true classic of science fiction literature quite favorably, written by Arthur C. Clarke, and I think this is the better book. It's another book, like Hothouse, where the plot expands to the point where it has almost nothing to do with the original stakes of the narrative, and it encompasses everything in the entire universe. And I think that that is great. And I looked up reviews of this on Goodreads, and there are all kinds of mouth breathers whining about that. One should not base one's literary tastes on the opinions of people that post Chris Hemsworth reaction GIFs in response to works of literature. Please do not let the Redditors fool you. Blood Music is an absolute, true masterpiece. It's almost a perfect book. There are a couple of little like narrative hiccups. A couple of the characters aren't Shakespearean. I found the ending quite moving. I read it in, I think, 2 sittings. Lifetime top 10 for me. And the last one that I read was Nova by Samuel Delaney. And this is the first Delaney that I've finished. I read the first third or so of Hog, which is a hard book to just sit down and read through. Hog is a topic for another video. Delaney is a really interesting guy. He was one of the big names in the New Wave explosion, and of those people, I think maybe one of the most experimental. This is a book that he wrote when he was 26, and it was his 9th published novel, which gives you an idea of kind of his native genius, I guess you could call it, or just his natural talent at writing. Nova is a space opera set in a far future where human beings have colonized multiple star systems, and human society is broken up into 3 rough sections. There's the central core kind of homeworld Earth system called Draco. There are the Pleiades, your little boy Pleiades. And then there are the outer colonies, which are basically mining worlds, and this roughly is symbolic of a 3-tiered hierarchy of caste, of economic class. So the outer colonies are the most working class, the Pleiades are the middle class, and the Draco sector, the Earth sector, are kind of the Anglo-Saxon ruling class elite. I'm getting exhausted even beginning to think about trying to summarize, not the plot, but trying to put into words Delaney's perspective or authorial flair. It's highly mythical writing. Feels very fantastical. It's a weird marriage of modernist prose, experimental modernist prose with old Count of Monte Cristo, swashbuckling, also Herman Melville. It's very, very 1968. In fact, he even mentions the mamas and the papas at one point. Despite that, it is a good book. I think it's to be read for the writing itself and the prose itself more than the plot, because the plot, while it is good, it is a little bit broad. It's just a little bit too Star Wars, which I know is a dumb criticism because Star Wars came out many years after this was published, but it has that feeling to it of big dumb space opera, but it's big smart space opera. I liked it a lot. I didn't particularly love it. There were sections of it where my eyes kind of glazed over. There were big lulls in the plot, and it wraps on a literary conceit that I kind of saw coming. Not to pat myself on the back too much, but I just think it's a little pat. It's also notable because of its place in the science fiction literary canon, its place in history. It was a progenitor of cyberpunk. Most physical labor is done via machines that have neural jack implants into the human body. So people plug into big pieces of heavy machinery, and that's how they pilot spaceships, which obviously was an inspiration for The Matrix, and one of the main characters is named the Mouse, and I think Mouse in Matrix must be a nod to the book. There's a very conspicuous and on-the-nose and blatant, kind of explicit discussion of class. There's explicit discussion of race. There's even a little bit of kind of Marxist meditation on labor alienation and how it's impacted by this new advent of being able to jack into heavy machinery and kind of the reserve pool of labor no longer being that vulnerable or exposed to unemployment, because you can just take your body and go anywhere in the known universe and find employment. So there's some interesting kind of political economy to the book. You don't read a lot of science fiction books that have Marxist theory built into them anymore, not in a real way, despite what people shriek about. So I liked it. I didn't I was not moved particularly by it. I appreciate it. Very smart piece of literature, and historically an important one. But as you can tell by my measured choice of words and my tonality, I was not in love with the book. I have no romance with the book. I do want to read more Delaney. A really fascinating person who has a really fascinating career, and I would like to read a lot more of him. I'd like to tackle Dahlgren, which is one of, well, I guess his masterpiece. That's considered like his big work. It's Dune length, maybe even longer. And I'd like to read Babel 17. I also have Jewels of Aptor somewhere up there, and maybe a couple others as well. So that was that. I started this Triplanetary by E.E. Doc Smith, one of the big, most influential space operas, first in the Lensman series. I don't think it can do it. I'm so bored by this. I can't. Too pulp. It's just too pulp. I can't be interested in it. I can't bring myself to do it. So let's pick a book at random. 336 possibilities. The Ophidian Conspiracy. I don't remember which one that is. Took me about 20 minutes to find it, but find it I did. There's the Ophidian Conspiracy. It probably is gonna suck very bad. But in the event that it does not suck, the purpose of this random pick is that I never would have chosen to read this over the big stack of classics that I want to get to. So I'm gonna give this a shot, the Ophidian Conspiracy. Maybe it's great. If you like the channel, please consider going to my Etsy and buying a book. I have a bunch of science fiction and fantasy books for sale on Etsy that are priced such that I profit about $5 when you buy something. All right, thank you for watching. I will report back on the Ophidian Conspiracy.